Alright, 110 video files. I think it's safe to say we're good to go. Hey, how is everyone? Somehow pumped up yet slightly depressed at the same time? Yeah, aren't we all? Yeah, so for some reason I was under the impression that last episode was like 3 weeks ago or so. Because I knew it was a long time, but it was actually a solid month ago, which kind of killed me a little bit inside. I was planning to include a little bit more in this episode, but honestly I think delaying this another full week would suck, and at least dropping this now will keep the focus of the episode steady on one aspect of the build. That being the front end swap. So, my dog Ginger had learned of the love that she got in her last episode and decided that she would get in on that YouTube fame train by signing for the parts packages while I'm at work. Signatures are hardly legible, but she's a fucking dog, what do you expect? I don't think she likes GSXRs, and she was very vocal about it, but I don't really want that type of language. Alright, so it's a complete front end off of a 2004 to 2005 model GSXR. Either a 600 or a 750 because those bikes actually shared a few parts, including the front end. Jigsaw guys will know this as the highly regarded K4 and K5 model, I believe. I went with this year because it has a specific dull gold that I really like, and it was also used on my SV1000, so I have some experience with it. So 2004 was the first year of inverted forks for the GSXR 600 in general, like at all. And even though the 750 has had inverted forks since about 1990, 2004 was also the first year of radial brakes for the 750. So I guess Suzuki, they had to redesign the inverted forks from the ground up to include radial calipers for the 750, and decided that, the 600 could use the 750 forks as well, just swap them between them. So for what I was looking for, the 2004 and 2005 bikes would be the cheapest route as the oldest option that satisfies my requirements. Now, I could have gone for a newer year, but manufacturers actually constantly change the shade of gold that they use on their forks. And in my opinion, the models after this one look cartoony, like it's almost too saturated, like it's almost amber, and it would kind of stand out a little bit too much on this build. They look good, but I always like these because they're gold, but it's a light gold, and because of that, it catches and reflects the light so much better compared to that dark gold. I also picked up a cheap cafe racer seat for like 30 bucks to help visualize the build a little bit better. So anyway, you can see the pile of parts that I have on my hands that I need to try to get rid of here. And since I didn't have that custom triple tree that I needed for the forks, I figured that I might as well try to sell some shit on eBay, clear out some space as parts for the build to be coming in and cluttering things even further, driving me and my parents crazy. So I figured I would just do a test run with two pieces, the seat and the taillight fairing assembly thing, just to sort of chum the waters, see how it goes. First up was the seat, which was honestly in pretty good condition with zero rips and an interestingly blue passenger seat section. I don't know K-bikes well enough to know if that's original, but the stitching very much looks like, well done OEM quality. So I rubbed it down with some back to black restorer, and I got it to look even better with a nice deep black surface. I took a shitload of detailed photos on my impromptu backdrop. I boxed it up, measured the box, weighed the box, and then marked what was in it. Had me feeling like a drug dealer and shit. I did the exact same thing with the tail, which is actually a pretty cool piece because the tail light, license plate light, and the turn signals are all integrated into it, connected by like 2 bolts and a single wiring connector. The plan was to sell it all as one piece, so I cleaned it up with some back to black to help, help with the sun fading. Then I boxed it up and did the exact same thing. So I posted both pieces for like $80 for the seat and about $70 for the tail after I looked at, how much people were selling these things for. My prices were super lowball in comparison because I just wanted to get rid of these things, and any price would be profit at this point. But nothing at all, even after I literally dropped the prices for both items to just $35 each. So I moved the parts because anything lower than that is an insult to my life. So I mean, if you want these parts, you watching the videos, you can hit me up about it, I guess. Now, on to the fork swap. On April 5th, I had ordered the Cognito Moto triple tree because even though the GSXR front end had come with a perfectly good triple tree, a custom one would be better for several reasons. Reason number one is that when you do a fork swap, generally the issue is that the size of the stem will be different and you won't be able to properly install the front end. It will either be too long or too short, basically. Everything else will usually be fine, but you won't be able to lock it down to the frame properly. Now, to remedy this, you can buy or make a conversion stem that's the proper length and specification that will allow you to mount the triple tree from the donor bike onto your bike's frame. So only thing you really need to change is the stem and the bearings, basically. Now, that's perfectly well and good, but that leaves you with the triple tree from the other brand. In this case, the front end triple would scream Suzuki with logos, and it will have things that I don't want, like an ignition mount and a bunch of unclean bolt holes and whatnot. It would also have the steering stops from the original GSXR, which stops the forks from smacking the tank, but obviously those are not going to work on a totally different bike. Now, if you're okay with all those things, then you're good to go. You know, get the conversion stem, get the bearings, and ride out. See, but I wanted to go a little step further. See, Cognito Moto has conversion stems for basically every classic bike under the sun and moon, including mine. But the more refined Tuxedo Winnie the Pooh option is to go for a full-on custom conversion triple tree. And Cognito Moto has just that. Now, you can get one for the GSXR forks specifically because those are actually the most commonly used forks for conversions on any bike, and you could get that for $600, or you could shell out another $100 and swap literally any fork you want onto any frame you want. So hey, you want a V4 Panigale front end on your Ninja 250? Fuck it, why not? Actually, there's several reasons to not, but honestly, it's your life, not mine. So I opted for the anodized black and integrated indicator lights options, which basically added an extra $100 to it. So be prepared for that shit. But the thing is, it's made to order, so even though I burned $700, I wouldn't even get to see the benefit until almost 2 weeks later. It was only natural that on April 9th, I would get that itch to start wrenching again, instead of waiting around for that part, you know, doing nothing. And I'm glad I did, because it actually made the job much easier later. So, April 9th. Step 1 was to put on pajama pants and 2 right-footed hunting Crocs. Step 2 was to finally put the frame back on the engine as the two had finally settled their differences. Step 3 was to figure out this fucking mess of wires in front of me that appears to be the front harness. See, there was several splices and twisty-tied connections with a shit ton of homemade connections as well. Like connections that made zero sense, like a wire simply going into the same wire, but with a random connector in the middle. Now, if you think of this rusty bracket as the predator mouth, the top 2 jaws have the wiring for the turn signals, because I remember that when I took the main fairing off. Naturally, the left has the left wiring and vice versa. So I just labeled those things and moved down the harness by cutting the zip ties that held it in place. I was horrified when I came to the conclusion that this front harness was clearly cut in half at some point, because these connectors look like repairs made for split wires, basically, like they were ripped apart. Hell, some of the repairs weren't even sheathed with, you know, shrink wrap or at least electrical tape, something. Some wires they didn't even bother with, and I have no idea what they're for. I always maintain that electrical work on bikes is always the most annoying part. You know, shit can get real wonky. I mean, exposed wires like this, and it's a wonder how this thing didn't smell like burning plastic all the time. For sanity's sake, I just wrapped the web of connectors in electrical tape so I wouldn't have to look at it again. And I sourced the front wire harness back to the main frame with single loop. By using the old jiggle wiggle method, I found a spot where it connects into the main mummy harness. And I was happy to see that it was actually a single junction plug, and I wouldn't have to start cutting wires and whatnot. So I disconnected the plug and I removed the entire front harness because I'm definitely not using that shit. So I labeled that connector and I moved on to the fairing stay itself. I know it's trash at this point because it was actually used as a lift point for us when we all lifted the bike through the house. So naturally it's all bent to hell. You served us well, soldier. With the fairing stay removed, things started to look a little bit more raw, and I managed to find a headlight connection which is oddly separate from the front harness that we removed. So the next step was to get that overly 80s gauge cluster off, which is held by 2 bolts underneath it. You break those loose and it'll pop right out. And yes, this thing is as heavy as it looks. The wires for it go directly into the mummy harness without a connector, which means I was gonna have to just disconnect it from the cluster and just let the wires hang in front, you know, because I don't want to cut wires just yet. The connection to the cluster is held in by 1 screw, so after you undo that, you can unplug it. Immediately I noticed that one of the connectors overheated and actually melted the plastic around it. Color me surprised. I can't even guarantee if this cluster works, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's broken in some way, so that's pretty much trash as well. Next up was that foam pad thingy that holds the accessory switches on the top of the triple tree and the ignition barrel itself. For the record, I still have no idea what these switches do. I mean, that looks like heated grips and that one looks like death. This thing is held in by 2 bolts as well, and I ended up cutting around the switches and just shoving them out the back, destroying the foam thingy basically. So that's trash too. Everything is trash. Next up was the bars themselves, which are pretty interestingly shaped because when the bike is actually fully clothed, they look like real clip-ons. Anyway, 4 bolts with an Allen key. See, these bikes have a funky braking system where the brake lines actually go through the neck of the frame as one, and then it splits off into 2 at the bottom and they go to each caliper. So it basically just cleans up the front end by hiding the brake lines. Next, I had to start sourcing the connections for the switch gear on the handlebars so I could remove the entire assembly without leaving any wires in the frame. The main controls on the left connect to this plug with a huge plastic shroud around it on the left, and the right controls connect to the same type of connection on the right side. I was happy to see how simple these connections were, and those intimidating shrouds had actually turned out to be something quite simple that I could eliminate right now. So I cut the shrouds because they wouldn't fit through the front of the frame with the connectors. After I unplugged them, I labeled the point in the harness where they connected on each side, and I slid them out of the frame like so. After I handled the wires for those unknown switches on the middle of the bars and some ground wires, the bars and everything on it was ready to come off as one piece. The bike itself was looking hella clean now, and everything that I unplugged was labeled and organized. In order to start working on the triple, the brake system had to be removed from the stem, which is as easy as removing a bolt in the nut and pushing it through the bottom. After that, we're more or less ready to start moving the front end from the bike, so I jacked the bike up and immediately run into a bit of a snag. See, I didn't have the correct size socket for the top nut, and I also didn't have the correct size spanner tool either, or wrench or anything. Basically, I had a size that was slightly too large, which, if I remember, was a 34, maybe, I can't really remember at the moment. It fit over the nut, but it would have stripped that shit out in a heartbeat with the amount of torque that was on it. I tried an adjustable wrench, but that would have just stripped it too, because the nut isn't actually really thick enough. So I found this random ass old hand socket that was not only very slightly too small, but it was also an SAE size. It wasn't even metric. It was like some fraction. I don't even remember what it was. It's in a video though. I mean, it's a European bike, so everything on the bike is metric. Nothing is SAE, but it almost fit enough for me to want to try something a little bit cheeky. I basically forced it to fit by hammering it onto the top nut. I sprayed WD-40 down through it, which all fell into the threads because the fit was so tight. And then I took this big ass pair of pliers to it, and I made those threads my bitch. Get crafty, people. Next up was a top triple clamp, which was basically just held on by the two bolts pinching the forks. And just like that, the possibilities are endless with what front end you want to throw onto your frame. I set the old front end to the side and the impromptu socket was still on the nut, but that could stay there for now. What was important was that I give the new front end some attention while I still had the time. It was already outside of working, even though the custom triple didn't arrive yet at that point. The front end was filthy and dingy, and I wasn't even entirely sure what was dirt and what was blemishes. So it would be a good idea to give the fork legs a clean at least, you know? I whipped out my mask, my goggles, and that good old brake cleaner to start giving them a clean. You know, working on these forks in particular had started to give me flashbacks to the days of restoring the SV1000, and it made me feel nostalgic as hell. I should calm down though, because that was only a year ago. But then I actually didn't stop with just cleaning the forks. I actually ended up doing a quick mock-up of the front end on the bike just to see how they look. Even with the GSXR triple tree that can't bolt up securely to the frame as is, and the original BMW front wheel that can't bolt up to the GSXR fork securely. I also realized I didn't have caliper bolts, so I just hung them there with some Allen keys jammed through the bolt holes. So clearly this was, you know, purely for visual purposes only. I didn't even bother filming the install for that reason, but I'll go into full details for installing it when I actually get the proper parts for the swap later in this video. Instead, I just took some pics and posted them on Instagram and YouTube, and people were definitely on board with the look, which was definitely great to see. I went ahead and placed the seat with the famous wooden planks of lore, and I got a good idea of where this build was headed, and I'm definitely a fan. Now remember, I ordered the triple tree kit on the 5th of April, and Cognito Moto warns you that it takes 1 to 2 weeks to receive the kit, as it finally reached Ginger on the 16th of April. They use loose packing peanuts, which might be the most annoying object on the planet, but we won't let that get us down. So what's in the box? Well, you get the triple tree itself, which is comprised of the lower clamp that has the steering stops bolted onto it, and most importantly, you get that conversion stem that we spoke about earlier. That's the right length for the BMW. The other great thing is that Cognito Moto ships it to you with the stem already pressed into the lower clamp, which is no easy task. I actually don't think it's something that you can do without a press, and I don't own a press, so that's much appreciated. Hell, the next few steps are easier with a press, but totally possible to do without one. You get the 2 spanner nuts that set the tension for the bearings when you install them. The top triple clamp, which in this case has the optional indicator lights, that's what the wire bag is, and a retro style top nut. You also get 2 conversion bearing sets for the top and the bottom naturally, and these bolts, which are for the top clamp to pinch the forks. Some very basic instructions, and a sticker. The instructions paper tells you exactly how it should look when you install it, which when combined with some basic know-how, makes this impossible to get wrong. So that same day, even though it was close to sundown, I went out and I stripped down the GSXR front end that was still there when I made that mock-up on the 9th. The first step when doing a front end swap is to remove the outer race for the steering head bearings that will still be sitting in the neck of the frame even though you remove the front end. There's one on the top and there's one on the bottom. It's that silver ring that you can see right there. There's really nothing special about it. You just beat the shit out of it until it pops out. So I grabbed my heat gun, some WD-40, and a hammer with a flathead screwdriver, and I briefly heated the outside of the frame neck with the heat gun. I doused the bearing race with WD-40, you know, just to make this go easier. After all that, it didn't give me any trouble at all. And now the bottom one. Simple. So let me show you what comes with the bearing kit. So first you get the outer race rings to replace the ones that we just banged out of the bike. We'll have to bang these in the exact same way. You get the bearing unit itself, which makes turning the front end, well, possible. You get 2 spacers, one of which is mandatory and the other one you only use if the first one isn't enough alone. And I'll show you about that in a second. And then you get a rubber seal for the bearings so they don't rust out. First thing to do is replace the outer races with the ones from the kit. So I greased up the bottom one and I did that one first. And let me tell you, man, getting these things in is harder than getting them out. And you'll have to take my word for it because my camera died right here. So yeah, all I did was bang it in using a hammer and a wood plank. It just takes some time, you know? Just be careful to bang it in evenly around the edges, or else you might bang one side and crook it, you know, more than the other side, which will make the side that's out harder to get in. At some point, it'll become impossible, and you might damage the race in the process. Next step is to pack the bearings with waterproof lithium grease or whatever other waterproof grease you might have laying around. I just happen to have lithium grease from my BMX building days. It's my least favorite part of the job because it's ridiculously messy, but this is actually the true way to do it. This is the way that most people do it, so I don't know another way. You have to coat the inside with grease to protect everything from rust and from friction. When I went back outside, it was pitch fucking black. So as much as I wanted to get this all done that night, I wasn't about to work in the dark, so called it quits, cleaned up shop, and just got everything ready for tomorrow. So April 17th, the next day. It was about 7 a.m. and I didn't have any time for fucking bearing races giving me any shit. So with great foresight, I actually put the top bearing kit in the basement freezer the night before and I froze the sumbitch. The logic is that it will shrink ever so slightly and make installing the outer race easier for me. You just use the old race to get those last few millimeters where the hammer alone can't actually hit the race anymore. So with both new races installed, we turn our attention to the lower triple and the spacers and the seal that came with one of the bearing sets. So we have 2 spacers, right? They're used to make sure that the bottom of the frame neck clears the bottom clamp, because if they scrape or get stuck on each other, you won't be able to steer and things will probably get damaged if you try. So you install a single spacer and then you put the seal, you know, just to see if one is enough, and if it's not enough, then you know 2 will be needed. In our case, 1 is enough because as you can see, everything clears with no issue. Now remember, I packed the bearings for the lower clamp last night. It was too dark outside to install it. This bearing in my hand is that exact same one, so it's already packed with grease. I just greased around it to make pressing it into the stem a little bit easier. I already mentioned that I don't have an actual press, so I had to get a little bit crafty for this. Again, I found this door stopper in my basement, and the outer pole is actually super convenient. But the outer pole actually fits perfectly because it's wide enough to clear the stem, but it's narrow enough to only hit the inner race of the bearing instead of the outer part, which aids in not damaging it when, you know, hammering on it for minutes straight. This was actually hella clutch because it saved me a trip to Home Depot to get a PVC pipe that I was already planning on using. Let me tell you, it wasn't easy. In fact, it took a lot of elbow grease and WD-40, but eventually it did seat itself on the bottom of the stem. If you plan to buy this kit for any project, not even just a K-bike, this will definitely be the hardest part if you don't have a press. But don't be discouraged because as you can see, it's definitely possible with basic tools. You just gotta have at it, you know? So now we have to pack the top bearing with grease, which is the one I froze. But luckily that's the one that doesn't need to get pressed as it just literally sits on the top of the frame. Now you go back to the bike and you grease the outer races that you installed and you set the top bearing in it. And now is the point where you install the lower triple and the stem. And you'll know if the bearings are still good because it should swivel like super smooth like this, like mad satisfying. And then you lock it down with the rubber seal for the top bearing and then the 2 nuts that set the bearing tension. I tighten it, but not to spec because I won't be riding the bike anyway, and you know, what are the odds that this thing is gonna come off soon? Probably pretty high. After that, the top of the sandwich can go on, which is the top triple clamp and the top nut for the stem. And that's the triple tree mounted and done. That's it. The little bag right there, once again, has the wires for the integrated lights. Now the fork legs are ready to go on, and to complete the look, I also installed the clip-ons from the GSXR, even though I won't be using them for the final product. For some reason, one of the lower pinch bolts for the triple tree was torqued so tight that I swear to God, it actually threw sparks when I broke it loose. The forks were mounted, but I had run into a minor problem. See, the steer stops were too short to reach the tab on the frame. What this means is that even when they're extended all the way out, if the forks are turned all the way to either side, they will still slap the tank before the stops can prevent it. That banging sound is actually the forks hitting the tank. It's not the stops hitting the frame tab. So I just removed them for now, and I'll see if Cognito Moto makes longer ones, or if I have to have longer ones made, or if I'll just move the tank back, move the mounts back. I don't know yet, but this is something that can definitely be solved, don't worry. In order to clean up the look of the front end, I decided to take some of the GSXR components off the clip-ons, as they weren't really stealthy enough. At this point, I still didn't have the GSXR wheel. It was actually still in the mail. But still, I wanted to see if A, the kickstand would still work with the bike lowered like it is, and B, how the bike felt ergonomically on both tires. But after that, I still was in the mood to get more done, so I figured that I might as well just chop off some of the frame that was entirely useless even now. Basically, all of the frame from the rear shock backwards was just dead weight at this point. So I pulled out the grinder, and I got medieval on that shit. They probably heard a K-bike purist somewhere. I can't cut any further just yet because then the bike would have no suspension and thus would be unrollable. But I was now satisfied for the day. And by then, it was actually only 1 p.m. Really, the only thing that I could do now is just wait for that front wheel. The front wheel came in on the 19th of April, and thanks to Ginger, it was waiting for me when I got home from work that day, along with those caliper bolts that I needed. Funnily enough, the eBay seller actually sent it in a vacuum cleaner box, but I can't even judge because I'm definitely going to use this box when I sell the BMW wheel. The wheel has spots of curb rash, but what mattered most is that it wasn't bent anywhere and didn't have any wobble issues. See, I plan to fully powder coat these wheels, so honestly the current finish means nothing to me. Either way, you'll see how good this looks bolted up as is with the calipers, thanks to the hardware that also came. Immediately, you can see the size difference to the wheel next to the BMW one, and the smooth sport tire tread will also help the clean look we're going for. So I took the BMW wheel out and I rolled the GSXR wheel into place. I noticed that the axle has some very filthy threads, so I gave it a round of brake cleaner. Good old brake cleaner. Then I just tightened the pinch bolts. Now you notice that there's no rotors right now, and that's because I've ordered those on the 19th, which was the same day that this was filmed. But you can still install calipers without having rotors. So I dug up the old GSXR calipers that came with the front end, and for the first time in the series, I'm actually using brake cleaner for brakes. I honestly feel like a celebration is in order. This specific gear for the GSXR came with that ugly ass over the fender brake setup, which means that there's one line going from the handlebar to one single caliper, and then another line that goes from that caliper to the other one. And I hate it so much that I dug through my pile of shit to find the spoked stainless lines that I had made for the SV1000, which again had this front end. Well, the SV had R6 brakes and an R1 master cylinder, but I guess I had forgot that I basically had ape hangers on the SV because these lines were custom made for those bars, and naturally they were way too long for these low bars, like comically long. So this is where the bike stands right now. Front end is complete and almost operational. I just need brake rotors, which are on the way, but I'm not going to delay this video for some brake rotors. I'm going to focus on getting the subframe worked on so we can get a true idea of where we should go from here. And I can guarantee that the next episode will not take as long as this one did, for sure. But I'm sure we can all agree that the change was definitely as substantial as I mentioned in that post, right? And people have been hitting me up about how these videos help them with K-bike plans, and I'm glad to hear about that as well. As always, I'll leave updates along the way on IG, and I'll post some here too. I'll catch y'all on the next episode, which I promise once again will not take this long. Alright, have a great day and thanks for watching.